Welcome to Unit 19 of the TESOL course at Southern Utah University. In this video, we'll discuss the concept of error correction. We'll try to define an error, and as we define the error, we'll talk about different views that teachers and perspectives within the English language teaching field have about what is an error and how to address it. And we'll try to summarize it all by discussing some best practices for teachers. So a behaviorist view of an error is that an error is a bad habit. So we need to identify what are likely to be the common errors, usually by contrasting the learner's native language and the language that they want to learn, and identify here's where we think they're going to make mistakes, and then we try to point out those mistakes and fix them so that students don't make them anymore. So that's one point of view, is just an error is a bad habit. Let's fix it before it becomes an ingrained problem. A cognitive view suggests that an error is a natural developmental stage. As we learn a language, we're going to make errors, and that's okay. To address it, what we want to do is give more positive and negative evidence. And what that means is we want to show learners how to do the language correctly, but also give them examples of someone using the language incorrectly, and that will help them identify and notice, oh, this is a problem, I shouldn't do that, and then that will help resolve their errors in the future. Then we have a communicative view. In the communicative view, again, we think of an error as a normal developmental stage through language acquisition. And communicative view says, don't do anything. The error will just fix itself. Now, not everyone agrees with that. They bring up issues of fossilization, which we'll talk about later. But that is one view, is saying just don't address it. Naturally, learners, as they develop more language, will eventually fix that themselves. Their brain will sort it out, and it will be fine. Then we have an interlanguage view. And in the interlanguage view, they make a clear distinction between something called a mistake and something called an error. And a mistake is just a slip-up. A native speaker could make a mistake. We speak too quickly and we use the wrong form or use the wrong word. Anyone could do that. So mistakes or slip-ups should never be addressed. Don't worry about them. An error, okay, that is something that we do actually want to pay attention to. And so what we need to do is help learners notice the language a little bit better, because from the interlanguage view, an error is a result of receiving input, but it's not turning into intake. So they're not really understanding the input that they're receiving about the language and acquiring that and letting it become part of their system. So the way to address an error there is to spend more time explaining to the learner and helping them notice the language and notice the correct forms so that they will acquire them. Information processing view. This point of view thinks of language, especially second language learning, as just a system that we have to learn, like any other skill that we might learn. Not as just sort of natural process of acquiring language that all figures itself out naturally. Instead, information processing says language is a skill. When you make a mistake with a skill, you've got to identify it and fix it. So information processing says, yes, we need corrective feedback. Otherwise, it's never going to fix itself. The learner is not going to naturally figure out, their brain isn't going to figure out these mistakes on their own. So they need corrective feedback. So all of this comes up to this idea of fossilization, because one of the greatest reasons why teachers should provide error correction is to prevent fossilization. And fossilization is sometimes thought of the result of language that a learner is not ready for, and so they try using the language and they're making mistakes, and then that mistake becomes a habit that becomes permanent in their language, and it's very difficult to unlearn that habit. So that's why we call it fossilization. It's become permanent. It's stuck in their language system. And we want to avoid fossilization. And since we see fossilization happen in learners, then the idea is maybe error correction can help prevent fossilization. If we can catch these errors quick enough, we can help the learner understand what they should be doing and that will prevent more permanent problems. So there are many different views about error correction, but as we take a look at all of it and we take a look at what research suggests, here's some best advice or best practices that we can recommend to teachers. First, if teachers are going to provide error correction, they must make sure that the student is developmentally ready for the feedback. So if a student is making an error in a more complex grammatical form, or it's with a multi-syllabic word that the student just isn't really ready to incorporate into their language system, just let the error be, because the student isn't going to be able to process that feedback and make a change on it. So focus on the kinds of language that the student is ready for and that they can use realistically in their current developmental stage. Those are the kinds of errors we want to address, the things that students are ready for. And so then if we're going to respond to the error, we need to make sure that the student notices and understands the error. It doesn't help to provide feedback that students don't look at, or students don't pay attention to, or they don't even know that the teacher is giving them feedback. Sometimes we call this recasting. Sometimes a student will make an error and the teacher will restate the same phrase with the correct forms. But some people would say, well, if the student doesn't know that you're recasting and doesn't realize that you're providing the correct form to them, does it really do that much good? So they would suggest you need to point out to students, hey, thank you for communicating that. And here is the way it more commonly happens, and then just help them realize what it is that they can change. And then provide them with the opportunity to act on that feedback. So to make the change, or maybe they then repeat the phrase in the correct way, or they do some kind of activity where they're having to do some output that requires them to use the correct form. It can be very frustrating for a teacher who, for example, reads student essays and provides lots of feedback to students, and the students never look at it, and you see the next writing that the student does and all the same errors are there. And this is happening because either the student's not ready developmentally for that feedback, or the students aren't being required to notice and understand the errors, and certainly the students are not being required to respond and act on those errors and make those corrections. So if the student isn't ready for all those things, then the error feedback is just a waste of time. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is that as teachers provide error correction, even if all those conditions are met and the student is ready and they're going to notice and they're going to act on it, we need to make sure that we're not overloading the student with feedback. It can really be a detriment to the student's motivation and attitudes about the language. So we need to make sure that the student is ready and willing and wanting feedback, and that the student can manage that feedback without losing motivation. And so this really requires personal care to students, that we can understand what each student is ready for. And some students will love lots of feedback, and other students will be very fragile with their ego in the language, and we need to be very careful, and they may not be ready for any feedback. They just need positive reinforcement to practice and use the language. So as teachers, we need to be aware of our students' attitudes and sensitivity towards error correction, so that we can make sure that if it is provided, it's done in a way that they can accept it. So in our video, we talked about the different definitions of an error and how that influences how we might respond to those errors. And then we finished up with some final best practices on what teachers can do to make error correction, if they decide to do it, the most effective.